that's anathema to the federal bureaucracy. They do not like differentiation. What they want is sameness. They want one size fits all. It is a real problem when one state passes something like a GMO restriction. Then how does Little Debbie's get ho-ho cakes into Vermont? One state does it, and then you have a domino of all the states jumping in. So this is why it's so threatening to the orthodoxy, to the big federal narrative in the industrial food complex, is the fear of dominoing. Once one state takes the lead, dominoing through the other states, then suddenly you've got a political revolution on your hands.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Beyond Labels. I'm Dr. Sina McCullough with my amazing co-host, Joel Salatin. Hi, Joel.
Hi, Sina.
So I thought today we would talk about one of our favorite topics, more labels. There is a new label on the market as of January 1st, 2022. The USDA has a new label for genetically modified foods, but we're no longer calling them genetically modified foods. Now we're calling them bioengineered foods. So this new label comes from the law that Congress passed and President Obama signed into law. It's called the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard. And in it, Congress directed the Secretary of Agriculture to write this new regulation for how bioengineered foods are going to be labeled. So this was something, if you remember, there was like a state level, there's a series of state level labeling initiatives, right, where certain states wanted to go ahead and mandate GMO labelings in their state. Like if you remember, Vermont did this. And this law that was passed is actually in response to that state level labeling initiatives. All right.
Yeah, Sina, whenever a state takes the initiative on something like this, and this happens with like cottage food laws, food sovereignty laws, all these kinds of things. We have so much lost federalism in our country right now that whenever a state takes the initiative on something like this, the federal level tries to come in and override it. And we see that in not just food. I mean, housing. Of course, we've seen it in the abortion fight right now. The grand experiment that our country initiated to have a small federal and a big state presence has morphed into a small state and a big federal, and that's a real problem. But yeah, this is not unique to GMO. This is ubiquitous, within the culture. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And what I would love to do with you in this conversation is let's just outline a little bit for the listener what the new label is, just to pass on that bit of information, and then let's talk about the bigger issue with labels, and then let's provide our solution for all of these labels. And I want to point out real quickly, just like you mentioned, if you look at that law that was passed by Congress in 2016, the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard, there is actually a section in here called State Food Labeling Standards. And it's where they literally say in this law that states cannot directly or indirectly establish under any authority any requirements for labeling GMOs, basically, in their state. So they have effectively infringed upon states' rights there, right? And they're listing it under the guise of, oh, they can do this because of interstate commerce. Right? That's their distorted perception of the Interstate Commerce Clause in the Constitution, where, it should be, they regulate imports, exports, and between states, right? At least my strict reading of the Constitution, that's the authority that the federal government has. But now they've distorted that Commerce Clause and said, oh no, now we can regulate within the state, within the factories, within the slaughterhouses, we can regulate all this. And so in essence, you have that the federal FDA that is now over like even all the states organizations when I argue this in my first book that the federal FDA is actually illegal. So it's
Right.
but exactly what you said is what they did in this law, this GMO law. The Congress actually took the power from the state, so now states can't actually have their own labeling of
Yeah.
GMOs.
Yeah. The notion of of a sovereign community being able to determine, I mean, community in this case being a community the size of a state, uh, the idea that a community would actually think for themselves and create what they want and don't want um, their people to know about or you know uh, uh, deal with is anathema. That's anathema to the federal, to the federal bureaucracy. They do not like uh, differentiation. What they want is sameness. They want one size fits all. So the problem is, I mean, it is a real problem when one state passes something like a GMO restriction. Then how does little Debbie's get ho-ho cakes into Vermont? How does Procter and Gamble get? How does somebody get in there? And so it does definitely hamper trade, but of course that's the whole state's idea. That one state does it, and then you have a domino of all the states jumping in. So this is why it's so threatening to the orthodoxy, to the big federal narrative in the industrial food complex, is the fear of dominoing. Once one state takes the lead, dominoing through the other states, then suddenly you've got a political revolution on your hands.
Yes, yeah, and that would be dangerous for them, right? I mean,
Yes.
it'd be hard for the lobbyist for
Yeah,
first of all.
sure would.
It's much
Sure
easier
would.
for those lobbyists to go to the, people in Congress, and offer them,
Right.
backdoor deals and whatnot than to go to each different state. So,
Yes.
yeah, it
Yeah.
definitely makes it more difficult for the industrial complex there. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this new bioengineered food label. Okay, let me preface here, we know that GMOs are used in up to about 80% of all conventional processed foods in the US. So they have a large presence in the marketplace. We know many polls have shown that people want these foods labeled, the foods that are made with genetically modified ingredients, they want them labeled. So people asked for, well, not all people, we didn't, but a lot of people asked for Congress to step in, right, and create a labeling law. So here's an example of what you get when you ask Congress, when you ask the federal government to help regulate your food. Okay, so what Congress or what they've decided is the bioengineered means that the food has to contain detectable modified genetic material. Okay, this is really critical. Has to contain detectable modified genetic material. Okay, what that means is this new label is going to exclude many products. Okay, many products such as ones that are made with newer GMO techniques like CRISPR or TALEN or RNAi. Those are all techniques that are currently untestable. Okay, so without commercially available tests, we can't detect the modified genetic material. So those foods would not require this bioengineered food label. All right, so there's your first loophole. Then another issue with this new bioengineered label is that many times when you have highly processed foods, right, like in our grocery store, we have a lot of processed foods and we have a lot of highly processed foods that contain highly refined ingredients that are made from genetically modified materials. Well, the process of highly refining them often leaves no detectable modified genetic material, right, in the final product because it's so highly processed. So those products will also not require a bioengineered label. Some of those examples would be things like sugar from sugar beets. And according to the FDA's own website, genetically modified sugar from sugar beets is used to make more than half of all granulated sugar that's in grocery stores. Another exemption would be canola oil, genetically modified canola oil. And I read another complaint that corn syrup itself would not be required to be labeled as bioengineered, again, because you can't detect the genetic material in the final product because it is so highly processed. So you already have, oh, go ahead, Joel. Sounds like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I can't help but just to point out that that we in the in the authentic food space, we make a big deal differentiating between raw ingredients or unprocessed ingredients versus processed ingredients, not just because, well, for one of the reasons is because we know that processing it apes many of the nutrients, the enzymes. I mean, from something as simple as pasteurized milk, all the way to to something as changed as well, corn syrup in Snickers bars. Okay, the fact is that when you highly process something, it changes all of the nutrient ratios, the balances, and all these things that are supposed to be part of our body's metabolic capacity to assimilate all those nutrients in that food. And we know that many of them work synergistically. This fatty acids helps that fatty acid. This one helps that one. Butter helps you digest this, and you get these synergies. Whereas so we promote whole foods as much as possible, not the supermarket chain, but unprocessed whole foods. And so here we have a test that actually incentivizes. So here we want a GMO test, and what we get is something that incentivizes processing beyond whole detection. On our farm, we actually the corn and soybeans, the grains that we use, for example, in our chicken and pig feeds, every batch is actually tested for glyphosate contamination. We're GMO free, and it's tested for that. And that's fairly simple to test for in the raw state. But after going through the heat and the extraction and extrusion processes in highly processed, what you end up with is this kind of conglomeration out the end that doesn't test well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It definitely is incentivizing people to, utilize this, what I'm going to call this loophole, in these new regulations. And someone might actually ask, okay, well, so there's DNA in our food. Like, wouldn't that be a good thing to degrade that because we're going to be eating DNA? But this is one thing that really comes to mind for me. When you talk about one of the benefits of consuming whole foods, and as close to the way that that God provided them for us, like the natural raw form. Well, we're beginning to understand that there's microRNAs in foods, right? Little tiny micro pieces of RNA. And, so you have DNA and then it gets transcribed into RNA, all right? So there's RNA in different foods, and you actually consume those, you eat them. We think that they're encapsulated in something that's probably like an exosome, so it can make it through digestion. And then what happens is we think those microRNAs actually help regulate your genes. So they help turn on and off different genes. So we've seen this in the literature, in the published peer-reviewed scientific literature. We know that consuming rice, for instance, turns on certain genes and off other genes. So we think that this is part of a protective mechanism. So you know how plants can signal to each other, like when there's a threat in the environment. They can signal to each other through different ways. Chemicals are released and whatnot. Well, we think that one of the ways that plants help us adapt is through these micro RNAs. So it's pieces of their, genetic material that we're consuming that are giving us an adaptive advantage. And this is one, for me, critical reason to consume whole foods as close as possible to their natural state. So, and now what we're seeing is the federal government come in with these new standards, and like you said, they're incentivizing our food producers to process the foods even more highly, to make it more highly refined, so that they
Yeah.
can avoid the label.
Right. Do you think, Sina, that in your research, do you think that this RNA factor, this adaptive factor, does that get whatever reduced or challenged the efficacy of that be challenged in highly processing?
Oh, absolutely, because they degrade very quickly. RNA, DNA degrades very quickly. If you think of even the mRNA vaccines, right? They had a very difficult time trying to keep that RNA stable, right? It did different temperatures, and they had to freeze them, and I mean, with all the hoops they had to go through just to try to get that RNA to be stable. So yeah, RNA degrades very quickly, especially with the application of heat. So absolutely, these highly processed foods, I don't like to guarantee anything, but it would be very difficult to see that you're going to have any kind of microRNAs left after the highly processed foods that we have on the way that they
Yeah.
process them.
Right. Yeah. Here on the farm, I travel a lot and talk to a lot of farmers, and very, very often, for example, chicken feed especially is fed in pelletized form. Sometimes it's called crumbles, sometimes it's called pelletizing, and I've always encouraged farmers not to use that. I mean, whether it's organic or inorganic doesn't matter. I've always encouraged farmers not to use pelletized feeds because the heat to compress and then and extrude those pellets, it's extremely high heat, and while the industry says, well, that's more digestible because the animal doesn't have to do any work, it's already all broken down. That's like saying, well, let's all eat Snickers bars because Snickers are more easily digested than an apple. And of course that's the whole point, that your body has to work at it a little bit and exercise a little bit to actually break out all these wonderful nutrients.
Yeah, and we don't want to be consuming things that just digest very easily, because they tend to lead to a higher insulin response, right? These tend to be more what we call high glycemic index foods, and so if they are digesting very quickly, they're more than likely going to have an insulin spike. And insulin is one of the most inflammatory natural made compounds that we know of. So you don't want to be consuming those kinds of foods. Occasionally as a little treat, sure, but not on a daily basis. Okay, let me give you a couple more examples of other ingredients that could be exempted from this bioengineered food label. Additives like flavorings, colorings, thickening agents, and binders. So even if they're derived from GMO crops like corn or soybeans, some organizations are saying that those categories are actually going to be exempted because of the way that they are so highly processed. And there's the heat and the processing destroys the genetic material. So all of those categories are going to be exempted. The problem is those categories appear in probably tens of thousands of different products in our grocery stores. So there's another whole category of problematic, in my opinion, ingredients that are going to be exempted. Okay, let me give you an example of the complexity of this new regulation. All right, and this is actually an example the USDA gave. And then I want to move on to the bigger picture and our solution. All right. So here's the USDA's example of how this rule might impact labeling. They used a can of pork stew as an example. So pork stew obviously contains multiple ingredients. Now, if pork is the predominant ingredient listed first on the ingredient panel, the product would not be subject to this new labeling law, even if it contained ingredients like sweet corn that were genetically engineered. If the stew lists water, broth, or stock as the first ingredient and pork appears as the second ingredient on the ingredient panel, the product would not require the label either, even if the third ingredient was genetically modified corn. And that's because they overlook water, stock, and broth. So if the stew contained more corn than pork, though, the ingredient panel will list corn first and the disclosure would be necessary. So literally, it's the order in which the ingredients appear. So if corn appeared first in this stew list of ingredients, right, it's the predominant ingredient, then that pork stew container has to be labeled. If the corn was, let's say, second or third, it doesn't actually have to be labeled because the predominant ingredient was pork and or the water, stock, or the broth. So literally the ingredient can still be in there, but because it wasn't one of the predominant ingredients, it doesn't have to be labeled. I mean, isn't that crazy?
That's just, yeah. I mean, the sleight of hand, is so, well, as Paul Harvey used to say, it's so obvious it doesn't require elaboration. Yeah, you just, you realize that people created this. This was done with intention. This is not, oops, we didn't realize what we were doing. This was done with and that's what I think you and I both really try to encourage folks to realize. We've got to quit being duplicitous people. We've got to understand that there are huge financial and emotional and powerful interests that want to sandbag any effort to create authenticity, to any of these things. And so when you sit down and say, well, the government oughta, I never do that. Well, the only thing I say, the government ought to get smaller, but as far as the government oughta, whatever, to take care of this problem, generally, it's, it's not better out the other end.
It's not. And just like you said, so this is an indication of what, like you're talking about, that they're not trying to be consistent and they're not trying to be transparent. So there are several options for how a company can use the label. Okay. So a company is compliant if they follow any of these options. They can use the bioengineered symbol, which is a USDA, the USDA Agriculture Marketing Service developed a new symbol. And get this, so it's this circular green symbol. It has kind of a non-discriminate crop with the plant on it, with a blue sky and a sun, right? Like bright, pretty colors. It looks happy. And it says either bioengineered or derived from bioengineering. So there's that label they can stick on the food. Or they can list a text disclosure that can say something like bioengineered food or contains a bioengineered food ingredient. Or they can put a phone number or a text number. It would say like, text this number for bioengineered food information. Right? That would be on the package. Or they can put on a scannable code. So you'd have to have your phone and scan the code, and it would pop up information on it. And very small manufacturers, can actually direct the consumer to a website where they have to go to find the information. So could you imagine, like, I can't imagine being in the grocery store with my kids, right, including my toddler, and they're just grabbing stuff. I'm trying to get them to not, like, grab glass containers and drop them on the floor. And here I am trying to pull out my phone or look up the website and see, does this contain genetically engineered ingredients? Plus, the whole concept of genetically engineered ingredient, right? That's misleading because people aren't very familiar with that one. People now know genetically modified or genetically engineered, and now they've changed it to bioengineered, right? Isn't this the tactic though? Right, when we get onto something and then and they're starting to get pushed back, then they change the name of something, right, to add even another level of complexity. And in fact, the Center for Food Safety is suing the USDA over this label for a multitude of reasons. Some that we just discussed, that, you know, the word bioengineered, that it's misleading. And I thought you would find this interesting, Joel. They said one of the reasons why they're suing is because this the new regulation, which I looked it up, it's like 63 pages to read in order to figure out the new regulation and what's in it. It says it fails to follow the 2010's Plain Writing Act. So I looked that act up. I kid you not, Joel. In October of 2010, Congress passed an act. This was the purpose. It says the purpose of this act is to improve the effectiveness and accountability of federal agencies to the public by promoting clear government communication that the public can understand and use. So Congress literally had to pass an act, pass a law to demand that the organizations, these government organizations, write laws in a way that the everyday citizen can understand them. Like, is that not telling you they know it's too complex, right? They know it's intentionally confusing.
They know, and you know, the I think, Sina, the worst part of this is that all of this, the effort, the lobby effort that goes in by sincere, you know, look, I'm not detracting this, sincere-minded people that really think, oh, finally, you know, we're gonna finally be able to have, you know, transparency in the food system. We're gonna know something. What once you see how this, as we would say, how it shakes down, what you have is not something that offers more transparency or understanding. It actually lulls people into a false sense of knowledge.
That's right.
That then precludes them even searching for anything else, because to actually follow the yellow brick road here is so complex, nobody will follow the yellow brick road. And so you're intentionally obfuscating it so much that the average person will just you know, not follow through, and so it's a society lulling thing rather than a societal whatever exposure thing. And that's probably the worst part of the, you know, the outcome.
I completely agree. And, you know, so I looked back in my book, because I was reading this law, and I said, you know, I think I wrote about this law. You know, we write about so many things, we kind of can forget everything we write about. So I looked back in my book, and, you know, I have a whole section on just this law, when they passed it in 2016, and I called it the labeling war. Because you can tell just the way the law was written, this was going to be deceptive, right? You can tell that lobbyists were going to have their hands all over this. And what you just said was my biggest concern. This was going to lull us back into a false sense of security, just like people got lulled into the false sense of security when the FDA was created in the first place. You know, It was like cheered nationally that, oh, now our food's going to be safe, right? And look what's happened. And so that's exactly what happens with these laws, is that people think, oh, okay, there's now the USDA is in charge. They're going to have this uniform label. All I got to do is go out there and look for that little happy seal, which is not the case. But as you have heard, just from me trying to understand the law myself, right? And I'm used to doing this, right? And even I'm looking at it and I'm like, what? Like, there's so many different exceptions. I would not know myself to go in there and be like, okay, now which product does have it, which one doesn't.
Mhm.
And I want to talk about our solution, but I want to bring up something that you've already touched on. I want to elaborate on this just quickly. I think the big problem here is that we have what appears to be, it seems like we have a fourth branch of government, right? An unelected, unaccountable fourth branch of government called the bureaucracy, right? This was Congress created these things. So like Congress created the FDA, the USDA. So they created this bureaucracy, and then it seems like what they do is they write these laws and they hand more power over to the bureaucrats. So, for instance, in the law we're talking about, the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard, if you read this law, it says, it talks about the secretary. The term secretary means Secretary of Agriculture. They gave powers to the Secretary of Agriculture to regulate the promulgation of this law. I mean, they basically said the Secretary of Agriculture is over this whole thing. So if you read the law, the secretary gets to decide the amount of a bioengineered substance that may be present in a food in order for the food to be called bioengineered. So, that's the stew example, right? So they get to set all these things. They get to define what actually bioengineered means. So here we get the loophole with the new technologies not included. And they get to decide how it's going to be labeled and what qualifies. So we have this bureaucracy where Congress knowingly created it and knowingly keeps handing over more and more power to these bureaucrats. And it's like, well, what are we going to do about it? Because we can't fire them, we can't vote them out of office, but that
Right.
bureaucracy just keeps growing and growing.
Yeah. I think out here in the country, Sina, we call that the fox guarding the hen house.
Yes.
So, so wow, this has been really enlightening, Sina. Thanks for kind of unpacking a little bit of this for us. It certainly doesn't give us a good feeling about where our government is headed and how it does anything. And so it obviously begs the question, well, so what do we do about it? Where do we find things? And I think we're gonna bring this podcast to a close, and we're gonna fire this topic up for next week and talk about solutions to this.